Welcome to another Silicon Bytes episode. And before we get into this one, thank you to everyone who has helped us to achieve the target of the Jiggers Paw night drones. That's the campaign that we're running at the moment, the fundraiser. We are continuing with that because we still have the raffle to complete tomorrow. And we're now beyond target, which means we can buy more drones that will help Ukraine remain resilient against Russian aggression. So your support is incredibly well appreciated. Thank you, of course, to everyone as well who has supported us on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee as well. As you'll know, we are putting on multiple events this year. We've got new ones coming up in April and May, which the planning is going for, and your help and assistance will ensure that we can put those events on, that we can film them and make them available to a much larger and more impactful audience via the channel. Now, let's get into today's episode, and it is about the drone assault on Moscow. Amidst all the headlines about peace negotiations and a rather premature tone in some of the media that the end of the war is in sight, it's easy to overlook the significant drone strike on Moscow that occurred on the 11th of March. News moves so fast, it seems impossible to cover everything, but I think the symbolism of Ukraine's assault on Moscow is too great to ignore. Ukraine launched a massive drone strike on Moscow overnight on March the 11th, ahead of the US peace talks taking place in Saudi Arabia. According to Russian military reports, which rarely, if ever, reflect reality, it shot down 337 Ukrainian drones over 10 Russian regions. This is likely to be the largest drone attack on Moscow since the start of the full-scale war with Russia. And the timing is not coincidental, coming just hours before a delegation from Kyiv was due to meet with the United States representatives for peace talks. Ukraine's armed forces struck a number of strategic objects of the Russian Federation involved in ensuring armed aggression against Ukraine, a statement Tuesday confirmed. 3 people were killed and 18 injured, it was reported, and footage clearly shows several damaged residential buildings, though these could well be caused by fragments of drones shot down by Russian air defense systems. It means the intended targets of those drones may not be entirely clear. The most massive drone attack on Moscow has been repelled tonight. Some 74 drones were shot down near Moscow and hundreds at different frontiers, so said the city's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, in a statement. Russia has launched a criminal investigation into terrorism, though it's worth balancing this reporting to say that Ukraine is being pounded nightly by Russia, and unlike its adversary, has not been proven to target purely civilian infrastructure. Indeed, Ukraine's armed forces said the attack targeted strategic facilities involved in Russia's war of aggression and claimed that Russian air defenses were to blame for damage to a number of civilian infrastructure facilities. Nonetheless, collateral damage must have been expected on the Ukrainian side when they planned this operation, and hitting the heart of Moscow was a highly symbolic choice. Further to this, officials in Kyiv said the attack was a signal to Russian President Vladimir Putin. All the drone strikes in Russia tonight on Moscow, on airports and so on are the signal to Putin that he must be interested in a truce in the sky that Ukraine is going to offer today during talks. Not only oil refineries. Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Ukrainian Government Center for Countering Disinformation, said in a video statement. Drones can also massively attack Moscow. Of course, air defenses shoot down those drones, but this does not save Russians from the panic that they cause. But this is also a signal to the US that Ukraine still has cards to play and that Moscow is not the dominant force in the war, and neither are their cities secure or their victory inevitable. Asked whether Ukraine's overnight attack was perceived as an attempt to compromise peace negotiations, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said there is nothing to disrupt yet, as negotiations with Ukraine haven't yet started. Moscow's formal response to the offer of a ceasefire has not yet been received, but Putin has been filmed attending a meeting in military fatigues. That is the first time during the full-scale war that he's been pictured wearing such an outfit. The symbolism of this is not yet clear, although Putin, his face, did look extremely drawn and frail. For now, the Americans, in their own words, are trying to understand how ready Ukraine is for peace negotiations. There are no negotiations yet, so there is nothing to disrupt here, said Peskov. Now, that is a curiously measured statement from Peskov. Maybe the policy has not yet been decided in the Kremlin, and the appropriate propagandistic slogans have not yet been crafted, have not been chosen. The Ukrainians say they are hoping for constructive dialogue, and the US has made the first gesture towards encouraging Russia to engage, that is, resuming military aid from America and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Among other things, we will offer truce in the sky and at sea, but Russians also must agree to it because it is about mutual actions. But from our side, it is a serious proposal. This came from an anonymous Ukrainian official who talked to Politico magazine. We hope for constructive dialogue, and in general, the composition of the Ukrainian delegation demonstrates that Ukraine is serious about this meeting and its goal. It is truly a high-level delegation. In a parallel process, NATO leaders from 30 countries gathered in Paris, notably without the US, to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. The outcome of these processes is by no means certain, and even consistent support for Ukraine from the US must be in some doubt. So European democracies must be keen to shore up support from Kyiv should Washington change its approach and its tone once again. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have been leading efforts to convene a coalition of the willing that would support Ukraine with peacekeeping troops in the event of a peace deal. Getting back to the strike on Moscow, flights were suspended at all 4 of Moscow's airports. 2 other regions in the Yaroslavl and Nizhny Novgorod regions east of Moscow were also closed. Russian telegram channels shared images showing the aftermath of drone strikes in a car park outside Miratorg, one of Russia's biggest meat producers, which killed 3 security guards and damaged about 40 vehicles. Moscow residents have been quoted as saying, "The sound of drones woke us up. Then came the explosions. It was the loudest night in 3 years. Absolutely terrifying." Also, there was some anger in Moscow about the apparent lack of warning from Russia's emergency services about the drone attack. How did so many drones cross the border from Ukraine unnoticed? Where were the alarms? One resident wrote on Telegram. Like their Ukrainian counterparts, Russian officials and Moscow-aligned telegram channels linked the attack to the peace talks. The meaning behind this largest drone attack on the Moscow region is clear. It coincides with the start of negotiations in Saudi Arabia, where Ukraine will try to push for an air and naval ceasefire that is absolutely unfavorable to Russia, wrote the popular pro-Kremlin channel MIG Russia. The raid is meant to suggest that such a decision would supposedly benefit all parties, but it won't work, the channel added. And these are common noises amongst pro-Kremlin and pro-war channels, that peace talks under the current circumstances would create the optics of a victory for Ukraine and would make it harder for Russia to spin this as a victory to their domestic audience. Even before US military aid was paused, it's become clear that the role of artillery has diminished, relatively speaking, and Ukraine is more reliant on its fast-growing drone industry and their rapidly evolving capabilities. Besides, the production of domestically made artillery systems has increased enough to sustain its defense efforts. So Ukraine does have more cards than perhaps either the US or Moscow credit it with. Ukraine and Russia have developed innovative and increasingly sophisticated UAV programs. Kyiv has established its own drone command and has improved the range of its systems with attacks hundreds of kilometers into Russia. Kommersant, a Russian news outlet, said Ukraine primarily used the AN-126 Lyuty, or fierce drones, for Tuesday's Moscow strikes. As Moscow's residents are asking, we also need to wonder how Ukraine's unprecedented drone attack managed to break through Moscow's air defenses. As mentioned, the drones used are made in Ukraine and were sent in such numbers that Russian air defenses were unable to cope, apparently. And Ukraine is tooling up for a long fight. It is in the process of developing a huge unmanned air force that would produce around 30,000 long range drones and 3,000 ballistic missiles per year. Most nights, Ukraine is hit by waves of 100 to 200 cheap Shahed type drones. A 40-kilogram bomb powered by a lawnmower engine, which is sent along with ballistic missiles carrying half a ton of high explosives. The drone swarms are intended to distract and overwhelm Ukraine's defenses and deplete the multi-million-dollar air defense missiles supplied by Europe and the US. But Ukraine's drones are allegedly of a higher grade and use the latest technology to get around Russian radar, avoid its surface-to-air missiles, and fly on to targets accurately by navigating themselves. We're leading the world in some of this weapon technology, and we just need a bit more time to get right ahead of the Russians, said a senior officer in the new Ukrainian UAV force. Ukraine used to be the main producer of rockets for the Soviet space program, we must remember, and has built up an impressive tech industry that can supply engineers and programmers in the required quantities for this 21st century conventional arms race. What's especially curious about the drone attack is that outrage from Moscow has been muted and the messaging about any response unclear. Acknowledging the scale of the attack may make Moscow, and by extension Putin, seem weak. Similarly, the US has tried not to pay too much attention to this, possibly understanding the clear messaging designed to push for an air and maritime ceasefire in the first step of a process that President Trump is pushing. Ending the war will play well with his base and allow for him to concentrate on further consolidating his domestic political power in the US, as well as dominate headlines for a short time. But is Vladimir Putin serious about peace? Well, everything we know about the militarization of his regime and indeed society, the state of the economy, and the mobilization of a huge network of pro-war propagandists that form an integral part of the very survival of Putin's regime suggests to me that peace is not his objective. He does not want it, but he may need a temporary peace in order to replenish Russia's war finances and restock its military arsenal. Possibly he will also seek a strategic reset so that he can set his sights on a less formidable adversary than Ukraine, one which he can score a decisive military win against and possibly gain more human and material resources to continue his aggression against the West.